Hi everyone, my name is Larene and it's my pleasure to be talking about making data visualizations inclusive and accessible to everyone. My Twitter handle is LareneLG and I tweet mostly about accessibility. I want to just thank Peter and the amazing DataEngBytes team, the wonderful sponsors, the other speakers and everyone who is attending. Especially in times such as these, it's really nice to be able to get together virtually and enjoy a conference, so thank you. There's a lot to cover in 25 minutes, so today I want to focus on the most practical things that I hope you can take away and apply to your job tomorrow. I'll spend a large chunk of this talk doing a live demo of how I build inclusive data stories, followed by a link to a list of dataviz and accessibility articles at the end. In this presentation, I'll be channeling the concept of inclusive design. For those who haven't heard of inclusive design before, here's a quote from the Ontario College of Art and Design University in Canada. Inclusive design considers the full range of human diversity with respect to ability, language, culture, gender, age, and other forms of human difference. In order to be able to design inclusively, we must work against our unconscious biases. I am an able-bodied, young, middle-class, educated woman who lives in a wealthy country with pretty decent internet. I need to mindfully consider those who do not have the privileges that I do and how to design and build towards equal access for everyone. It's not easy and it takes practice, and we'll all make mistakes along the way. So what is digital accessibility? In this context, I'm talking about the skills and practices behind designing and building websites, apps, and content so that they can be used or consumed by people with disabilities. So you're probably wondering, how is it even possible to make data visualizations accessible for blind people and people with low vision? The whole point of it is that it's visual. When I started working on building live data charts around a year ago, I thought the same thing, that it was just way too hard. But I was determined to prove myself wrong. I know that designing for accessibility creates a better experience for everyone, and the best thing is that it makes sure that we don't exclude anyone. Another common misconception for those new to accessibility is that accessibility is only about building websites for blind people. As I mentioned before, designing for accessibility creates a better experience for all. Here are some examples. Being mindful when using color means that you don't exclude 8% of males and a small percentage of women who have some form of color blindness. Having high contrast and large fonts helps those with low aging vision, but also makes text easier to read when you're walking around the sun trying to look at your phone. Using plain and simple language vastly widens your audience, and there's research to show that it's preferred even by highly educated specialists. When efficient and inclusive communication is needed, keep it short and sweet. Animation is a great tool in dataviz, but it's best kept to a minimum to prevent some people from feeling nauseous, and definitely don't use flashing colors that could trigger epileptic seizures. Websites that contain images with alternative text are essential for blind and low vision folks, but those websites also rank higher in search engine results. Subtitles and transcripts for video and audio are needed by those who can't hear, but are great for language learners and memory recall. And if you want to use text, and if you want to look for something specific that you heard in a video or podcast. Being mindful of keeping your file sizes small helps those in poor countries with high data costs be able to access online resources. With that in mind, let's begin the design session. Now, I do not have any formal training in design. I'm a software engineer full-time, but I have learned a few basic design principles throughout my career. What we build today won't look anything like something that might be on Information is Beautiful. Those data visualizations can take up to a whole team of data analysts, designers, developers, and journalists to create. So let's start by grabbing a dataset from data.gov.au. You can find plenty of great public datasets on there. This one is on school students with disabilities in South Australia. And what I did was I got the raw data and put it into Google Sheets, and below that I calculated the percentage of students with disabilities out of the total students. And let's start off by doing a little bit of work in terms of trying out a few different chart types, seeing what works best with the data. Here's a stacked chart. You can start to see some trends, but it's not my favorite, so I'm going to go back to the line chart. Don't forget to add a useful title. I'm just going to steal the one from the original data source. And this looks like a pretty good starting point, but we can do a bit better than this. So I'll save this chart from Google Sheets as an SVG and open it up in my image editor. I'm using Adobe Illustrator here, but any image editor will do. SVGs are really nice to work with because you can just grab the parts of the image that you want. So what I'm going to do is just grab the lines from the chart and copy and paste them into another design application I use all the time called Sketch. And the only reason why I've picked Sketch is because it's something that I'm used to working quickly in, so it's nice and familiar. I'm going to grab the grid lines as well because we need something to have a reference. And while we're resizing the chart, we don't have to be too exact. I'm not too worried about whether it matches up perfectly to the data. Someone looking at this chart doesn't need to know the exact percentage points either. And now I'm just going to start building the visualization in Sketch manually. So I'm putting the years along the bottom. The data was actually taken in term 3 of every year, but that's a little bit too much information, so let's keep it simple. Great, we've got all the years, that's looking good. So now we'll also put the percentages on the y-axis. I've made sure just to have the whole numbers, no percentage points, no decimal points. And since the highest data point is 3.3, let's make the axis go all the way up to 4% to give it a nice little bit of white space. So that's a pretty good start. I've made the lines a little bit thicker. I like how that looks. And instead of using a legend, I'm just going to grab each of the labels or categories and put them right next to their data lines. Note that the lines at the bottom are a little bit close together. So we'll just have to make sure that we put each of the labels in order. Just double checking we've got it right. So we need to do a little bit of cleaning up. We'll make it a little bit smaller and make sure that they're all lined up correctly. Now notice the language and communication line is overlapping some of the other data points, so I've moved that label over to be as close to the line so it's clear that that is the language and communication line. So notice that the color of my screen has changed slightly. What I'm doing is using a color blindness simulator app called Color Oracle, and it checks for various types of color blindness. I've got Color Oracle set up so that I can press F5 to simulate red-green color blindness, or press F6 to see what the image looks like in grayscale. And this is really handy to make sure that I can still understand any diagrams or images that I've designed and make sure they are still understandable if a person cannot see color the same way that I do. So we're viewing our dataviz using grayscale at the moment, and it's a really good way to double check that we haven't just used color to convey meaning. If we had decided to stick with color-coded legends, now would be the time that we would find out that it's not very accessible. Another tip is to just start off straight from the get-go working in grayscale and adding color later. So let's keep working on this. I'm not quite happy with it yet. Something we need to make sure that we don't forget is to include the data source somewhere in the visualization, or if you're including this visualization in an article, making sure to include a link to the source inside of that article near the diagram. I always like to include the link to the data source inside the image itself because it means that we don't forget to credit the source when we're sharing on something like social media. So now let's add a title to our visualization. Don't forget to make it nice and big using plain simple language. And I also like to include a subtitle as well. It's a great place to include any extra information that might help people to get an accurate understanding of exactly what the chart is talking about. I'm not too happy with the titles I have here, so I'm going to steal them from something I prepared earlier. So we ended up with a title of Percentage of Disabled Students in South Australia from 2013 to 2018, and full-time equivalent enrolments of students by their primary verified disability. nice and clear and easily understandable what the chart is trying to show. So I'm going to keep tweaking the chart a little bit. I'm going to change the labels to match the color of their data lines, just to make it really clear which label matches which line on the chart. And something that I always do while I'm designing is to use an app or plugin that I've installed into Sketch to check the color contrast of text on its background. Web accessibility standards recommend that the contrast ratio between text and background should be at least 4.5 to 1, if not 7 to 1, to be really legible to those who might have low or aging vision. But high contrast also makes it easier for everyone to be able to read the text. The plugin I'm using here is called Stark, and I'll make sure I'll link to it for those who do use Sketch and would like to download it for themselves. I'm going to remove a little bit of redundancy from the labels to make it even simpler. The word disability is repeated a whole bunch in the labels, and we know that this chart is talking about disabilities, so I'm going to remove that. And just some finishing touches. I'm going to lighten the axes labels a little bit, just to really make the lines and the actual data stand out from the rest of the chart. And that's it. This is our final chart. Pretty cool, huh? So this is a great data visualization, but it's not quite data storytelling. Data storytelling is about using data visualizations to create change, and so we want to be able to tell a story with our data so that a person can come away from our visualization ready to act, make a decision, or even slightly entertained. This is a really good time to ask yourself why you are making this visualization. What is it that you want your readers or viewers to do after they've seen the visualization you've created? And this is the secret to making data visualizations accessible to everyone, including those who cannot see the visualization at all. So I've only been working with dataset for about 30 minutes, so I don't have any real observations. I'd like to do a lot more analysis before I can make any conclusions for sure. But let's say we had some findings about the two rising rates of primary disabilities here, speech and or language, as well as autistic disorder or Asperger's disorder. The first thing that I'm going to do is change the title to tell the audience straight away that this is what this chart is all about. Because the title is a bit longer, we can no longer fit the year on it, so I'm going to move it down into the subtitle. Since we're only focusing on the two growing primary disability rates, I want to make sure that the viewer's eye is directed straight to the two growing rates of disability, and I'm going to do that here by changing the color of the labels and the lines of the other primary disabilities to grey. I don't want to remove the other lines completely because I think it's still good to have them there as a comparison to show that these are the only two growing rates of primary disability. What I'm going to do now is add back in the two data points in 2018 for the growing rates of disability. And the reason why I'm doing that, because if you look at the y-axis, you'll see that the top number is 4%, and that doesn't sound like a very big number by itself. And since percentages are relative, it'd be great to have the actual raw numbers in there as well so that you can understand how many students we are talking about. So I'm adding to the graph that in 2018, about 5,800 South Australian school students had speech and or language disabilities as their verified primary disability, and 5,500 students with autistic or Asperger's disorder. So I'm going to add some icons next to the raw numbers just of a little person, and the reason why I want to do that is because I want to make it really obvious straight away that these numbers are referring to people. In hindsight, these probably weren't the best icons. They're a little bit ambiguous, but they'll do for now. I'm also going to round these decimals of the raw data points to whole numbers, just to not distract from the information that we're trying to share. So just shuffling things around a little bit just to see what looks better in the space. I'll make the labels on the 2 lines bold. And one last thing that I've done is I've calculated the growth rate from 2013 to 2018 of the 2 disabilities that we're focusing on, as well as the growth rate of the total enrollments. This is something that the audience probably could have worked out from looking at the chart, but I think it's great to provide these insights and save the audience doing the legwork. Adding annotations to the chart is also inclusive of the audience members who might have low numeracy and chart literacy skills. And this is something to be super mindful of if you are creating data visualizations for the general community. Always providing a text summary of the insights of the chart helps people who might not have great chart literacy, as well as those who can't see the chart at all. So in 5 minutes of analysis, we found some really interesting observations in the data. Since 2013, total students with autism or Asperger's disorder has doubled, and speech and language disabilities has increased 1.5 times, compared to total enrollments only increasing by 4%. Since this paragraph is one of the main takeaways from the data visualization, I want to make it as simple and as clear as possible. And one way of doing that is to use bullet points so that you can see straight away that we have 2 significant insights that we want the audience to take away from this chart. So we're almost there. I'm not 100% happy with the colors. I think that green is a little bit ugly, so I'm going to go onto a color palette website called coolers.co. And just look for one of the trending color palettes. I've picked a nice blue, and I'm going to change the color so that both lines are a shade of blue so that it looks quite nice on the eyes. And I'm just going to differentiate this summary paragraph from the other text on the chart. And how I'm going to do that is using a rectangle and giving it a bit of color behind it. And there's a nice bit of drop shadow on there as well. I can't decide if I want to go with a light color or a dark color. I might go with dark and change the font to white, and I'm just going to pick the same color as the dark blue that I just picked for the line. I'm pretty sure the contrast will be fine with that, the white text on a really dark blue color. Oops, just one more thing. I've used the abbreviation FTE in the summary paragraph, and so I'm just going to define it in the subtitle by putting it in brackets after full-time equivalent. And there we have it, an inclusive data story ready to share with the world. Actually, and you might have already guessed this, we have one last thing we need to do. Most data visualizations are saved as image files, so we need to make sure that when we share it, we don't forget to provide a text description for people who can't see the image. For those who are not familiar with alternative text, on the screen I have an example of the HTML code you would need to write in order to show an image on a web page. The alt part of this HTML doesn't change anything about it visually, but it does provide a description to assistive technologies. Probably the most well-known type of assistive technology is a screen reader, which is a software program that describes what is happening on your computer using a synthetic voice. But there are so many more types of assistive technologies used by people with different needs. And these technologies expect certain accessibility elements to be present in our websites and our apps. And this is why following digital accessibility guidelines, such as always including alt text for images, is really, really important. But sadly, due to lack of awareness, there is no alternative text available for pretty much over 2/3 of images on the web today. And also, one last thing I wanted to mention here is that not every blind person uses a screen reader, and not every screen reader user is blind. Just like not all deaf people know sign language and not all people who know sign language are deaf. Inclusive design recognizes disability as a continuum or a spectrum. People with similar disabilities can and will have completely different needs. So now that we know how to add alt text, how do we even know what to write? Describing a picture that's supposed to be 1,000 words in either a sentence or two really takes quite a bit of practice. The tip I usually give is imagine you had a blind friend or colleague sitting next to you and you had an image that you wanted to describe to them. What would you say about the image? Luckily, dataviz and accessibility expert Amy Cesal recently came up with a really easy to use template for adding alt text to charts. The template is chart type of data, where, and then you include the reason for including the chart. And then making sure to include also a link to the data source somewhere in the text so that the reader can go and explore the data themselves if they would like. And now that we have a formula for writing alt text for data visualizations, let's come up with one for the student disabilities chart that we just finished building. Adding text descriptions is the final step to creating accessible data visualizations. So I've also changed the subtitle and title to make it clearer that these are school-age students. I showed the chart to a colleague and had a discussion about it and realized that they thought the data was actually about university students. It's always great to check by asking for feedback when you're almost finished. So let's go back to the alt text. So here is the template. When we're adding the image, we'll add the alt text. So starting off with the chart type, we're using a line chart here. What is the data? The data is the percentage of South Australian school students and their primary disabilities. And the reason why we're including the chart, we wanted to show that rates of autism have doubled and speaking and language disabilities have increased 1.5 times between 2013 and 2018. And for more complicated graphs, it's always great to include a paragraph describing the takeaways. Not only does this help blind people, but it also helps people with low graph literacy. So this is the end of my main content for today's presentation. I've included the next 3 slides as well as a handy reference list of tips that I mentioned during my live demo, plus some extra tips that I wasn't able to cover. The first slide is all the tips I wanted to give you on chart design. The theme is keeping things simple, clear, accurate, and consistent. The next list of tips is related to inclusive design. Being able to design for all humans. And the third slide is about telling a story. A few little things to remember to make sure that you are able to inspire action and create change. And one last bonus slide is also remembering to test with real people and not just asking someone if they like it or they think it's good. They're probably going to say yes to not hurt your feelings. But asking people to describe your chart back to you, and this might actually surprise you and help you to be able to communicate your message more effectively. And getting feedback is always really helpful and really important. You're not designing this chart for yourself, but other people as well. The best thing you can do is listen and have empathy and do as much as possible design with people instead of for them. So here are the links that I promised. I'll be sharing these links on Twitter as well, so you can find them later in case the slides don't come out anytime soon. The first link, bit.ly/dataviz-a11y-people, is a Google Doc that lists some great resources and also people to follow on Twitter who have been working in the data and accessibility space. And the second link is bit.ly/larenelg-dataviz-a11y-slides, which is the link to the slides that I just presented. And thank you so much for having me today again. I really enjoyed putting this presentation together, and I look forward to hearing about your questions. But if you want to learn more about accessibility in general, I have a tweet pinned to my Twitter profile, so please check that out, and I'll see you soon.